Welcome back, everyone. I am super happy to have author of Chaos, Tom O'Neill, with us today.
I know,
And
yeah.
we were chatting. Good, man. We were chatting before the show started, and I was just telling Tom I wanted to have him on because it took him 20 years to write this book, and I feel like most people give up on something after 2 days. So I'm really excited to hear about the process of never giving up on something you believe in, and chatting and learning about what Tom knows about Charles Manson and the what was it, the MK Ultra group,
Among other things, yeah.
amongst who knows what else we'll get into.
Yeah,
So like
yeah.
I know Tom's story was he got approached about the book and you weren't interested in the book, and then you somehow got wrapped up in a 20-year adventure.
Yeah, I got asked to do a magazine story. I was a journalist and mostly doing entertainment reporting with some investigative stuff, but mostly about the entertainment business. And they asked me just to do kind of a generic story on what was then going to be the 30th anniversary of the Tate LaBianca murders in '99. And long story short, I started uncovering information about the case and mostly about the prosecution of the Manson family for it that hadn't been reported before, and indicated that a lot of stuff might have been kind of withheld from the public about the Manson family's farther reach and other people's reach into the family. And the whole thing kind of became this rabbit hole of different conspiracies that I fell down. The magazine story was never published. I got a book deal, and it became a book project. And after about 7 or 8 years, the book publisher got impatient and they canceled the deal and they sued me for the return of the advance, which kind of put a halt on at least me trying to sell the book, but I could still report it. I had to fight the case in court, get a pro bono lawyer. And once that was resolved, meaning they got their money back, but in a different way than they wanted it, they only get it if I resold the book rather than just being able to take it from me, uh, from my whatever I made the rest of my life, which probably would have mean that if I hadn't published the book, I'd still be in debt to them now because they had given me a lot. So then I resold it, and then finally it came out in 2019. And I thought that would be the end of it, but little did I know I fell right back in, and I'm working on a follow-up book now.
Follow-up book to
To
unravel the
chaos.
loose ends that
Yeah,
you can
trying.
discover
Well,
over 20 years.
I haven't committed to it yet, but I've been reporting it since the book came out. So for Jesus, another 5 years now, which is scary. I've been reporting more, and if I get enough of the missing pieces, then we'll do the second book. My collaborator and I, and my original publisher, they all want it, but I don't want to do it unless the second book is more definitive than the first, because in the first I mostly lay out a lot of possibilities that I can prove, things happen differently, but I never found really the ultimate smoking gun I was looking for, which is fine because it does still, I mean, I present a lot of information that is all, again, completely documented, but it's frustrating when you can't have a period at the end of that sentence. So if I can do that, there'll be a second book.
And with the first book, at what point did you get like sucked into this?
Really early. I mean, probably with one of my first interviews, which was with the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, who not only prosecuted the case and became kind of a national hero in 1970, 71 when he put these monsters behind bars, but then he wrote a book about it, which to this day is still the best-selling true crime book of all time, Helter Skelter, and that became also a TV movie, which was the highest rated TV movie up to that point, two-part series. And then he went on to a successful career as a public speaker and author. He ran for a couple offices, and it really kind of created, he became a really well-known figure, but my book takes apart his case. And early on in the reporting, he slipped up in a couple in the first interview with me and said something that inadvertently, I'm sure he didn't intend it, kind of gave away the game and showed that he there was stuff in there that was important that he had manipulated. And that sent me down a path. I still was hoping it was going to be a magazine story for the first year and a half. And the magazine kind of got hooked on my reporting too. And the editor in chief put me on this special contract where all I did was work on this one story. And I got paid by the month for about a year and a half before he got fired by the board of the media conglomerate that owned it for spending all the money on me. So it's that kind of, the book also is written in the first person. So it's not just about what I'm finding, but also about how other people are reacting to it as I find it, and the obstacles that pop up. You know, Bugliosi started threatening me and getting really crazy with the kind of things he said he was going to do to stop my book and to stop me. So it's a real crazy roller coaster ride.
Yeah, it seems like it would have been pretty easy to throw in the towel at some point.
Well, yeah, believe me, I would. Quite often I would just stop in my tracks and say, all right, enough, I can't do this anymore. But problem is, once you've started and you've really invested so much already of your life and time, even when you're, you know, I was running out of money, I was getting sued, there were lots of threats of lawsuits and actually physical threats. But you just, at some point, and this is where everybody like me, for better or worse, gets, you know, you can ruin your life, is you have to prove that you were right the whole time. And I got stuck to it, and luckily I'm one of the people that came out at the other end. You know, I know I've met quite a few who start something for a couple years and it defines their whole life and they never get out of it. They never have anything to show for it, unfortunately. And that's what I was worried was happening to me. I mean, the saving grace really was getting a great collaborator, I think, who was able to kind of pull me out of the weeds, help me go through everything and present the book with me in not a crazy fashion that people actually seem to like.
Yeah, too many people start something but don't see it out to its conclusion.
Yeah,
And
I just couldn't
whether
do
whether
that.
you're being sued or all sorts of crap that you went through,
Yeah.
you just we're gonna persevere no matter what, which is cool.
Yeah, I had to. And you know, I didn't have a family, kids, anything like that. And I put that on a shelf, thinking again, it's just one more year, one more year. But if I were like you and I had a responsibility to a wife every night and a little child, I never would have been able to do it because it completely consumes you like 24/7. You're taking phone calls in the middle of the night, you're running off in the car to different parts of the state or country. And I actually went to Britain for a few interviews. So I don't know if they asked me to do it again. I don't know if I would. It was too much of a sacrifice.
Yeah, and this book is definitely eye-opening and pretty crazy about the story about like Charles Manson and MK Ultra. I was always like curious about Charles Manson. Did you ever like find out how he was basically a psychopath, but he could still stand trial? Was that like all part of like what you found or didn't find?
Yeah. Well, you know, he refused to put on an insanity defense, and his
Mm,
first lawyers wanted that, and he said he wasn't insane. And you know, he's never really been officially diagnosed, because he would never submit to the psychiatric testing. You know, at some point, I think in the 80s or 90s, when he was in prison, he did get diagnosed as schizophrenic, that kind of thing. But even those diagnoses came with a caveat that it wasn't an official diagnosis because Manson wouldn't, I don't know how they actually do it. I guess there's lots of testing involved and whatnot. He would never do that. The problem with him is he was actually really bright, very uneducated, you know, had barely like a fifth or sixth grade education. But he was really canny. You know, he's a con artist, really smart that way. And I was only able to interview him on the phone because the 1 year that he agreed to speak to me in the first or second year, he was always in solitary confinement. And he was only allowed out like once a week to do phone calls. And even then, he wasn't allowed to have visitors. So it was frustrating because if anybody's ever seen an interview with him, he plays games, you know, verbal gymnastics and speaks in riddles. And I really thought that if I were in the same room as him, I could cut that to the quick and get, you know, just throw stuff at him that he'd have to kind of try to answer. And having said that, I've seen some of the best interviewers not be able to do that, from Tom Snyder to Geraldo Rivera in his day was a pretty good interviewer. So maybe it wouldn't have happened. But one of the most telling moments was he had a third party on the outside, a guy called Grey Wolf, who would handle all of his media inquiries, and he'd listen in on all the calls and tape them. And after one contentious conversation, when Manson hung up on me and was really upset and said to stop asking him certain questions, Grey Wolf got on and he said, you can't talk to the old man like that, Tom. He really doesn't like that, and you could be in danger. And I said, I'm not asking him anything that I think is unfair. And he said, here, listen to this audio that I have of 10 minutes ago. And after you got off the phone, he was complaining about you. So he plays me this monologue from Manson where he sounded so coherent and sensible, like he's talking to his attorney, saying, this guy's trying to get me to admit that I knew about it. And I said, wait, why can't I get that Charlie? Why do I have to get the nonsensical, rambling, crazy Charlie? Clearly, this is all an act. And that was important, but I never got it. Well, I don't want to spoil the book, but you'll see what I did and didn't get from him in those interviews.
Is it creepy to have just like tapes of Charles Manson at your that you could just
Well, the
listen to at
creepiest
any
thing
time?
was, the very first night that I interviewed him, it was at nighttime, and my editor at the magazine at the time didn't want his people to have my home information, my address or phone number, so she made me do it at the magazine offices in Los Angeles where I was living. So I went in there after hours and got in and used one of the reporter's phones. And it's like 9 o'clock and I'm waiting. I can't remember. He had to call me at that phone. All of a sudden I realized it was Valentine's Day. And I thought, oh my God, my Valentine's date is Charlie Manson. How bad does it get? But when he called me and I picked up and I said, hey, happy Valentine's Day, Charlie. And he said, hey man, thanks a lot. Same to you. And I'm probably the only person that said happy Valentine's Day to Charlie Manson in 40 or 50 years before he died.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely something you could share as a icebreaker, fun fact.
Yeah, it's on my social media page. I put the audio up there. It's somewhere buried in my postings. I was at a wedding in Britain one year in the early 2000s, and there was another guest at the wedding who was in his 80s or 90s. And when he was a little Jewish kid in Germany, Hitler bought him an ice cream cone. So they had a competition at the wedding to see who had the worst brush with evil, he or me. And he won almost unanimously, because Hitler buying you an ice cream cone, especially when you're a little Jewish kid and he doesn't know you're Jewish, and me just saying happy Valentine's Day to Charlie, that guy won the prize.
Yeah, and being he like plays these games and there hasn't been any official diagnosis, does anyone like know why he carved that swastika in his forehead?
Yeah. He explained it when he did it. He had said he was Xing himself out of society. So he did that during the trial. And it wasn't a swastika originally, it was an X. He didn't turn it
Hmm.
into a swastika until he was in prison. So he carved an X into his forehead, and then his followers did the same thing. There was kind of a vigil every day at the courthouse where anywhere from 5 to 15 of his family members would sit in a circle and sing and just wait for hopefully him to be freed or exonerated. And they all carved the X's in their heads. And then when he did it in prison, what remained of the following, they, added the little corner. So it was a swastika at that point.
Hmm. Always
But
wondered.
the X was
Sherlock.
represented, the X represented him Xing himself out of society.
Hmm. Very artistic of him.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at him, he has people who think he was very profound, and every now and then you will see a quote by him that almost seems pretty prophetic. Where he'll say stuff that sounds like he had insight into stuff that was going to happen 20 or 30, 50 years later about race wars and things like that. I mean, maybe he was kind of a savant on the spectrum genius in a way, but also pretty horrible guy.
Yeah, because when he was originally in prison, didn't they taught him like how to win friends and influence people? Like,
Well,
and
he
then
got a
he
hold of
went
the
out
book.
and
That was one of his Bibles. Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right. He got a hold of the book, and then they were teaching courses in Dale Carnegie. That was in the early 60s when he was in prison in Washington at McNeil Island. Uh, and again, there were all these discrepancies. Some of the jailers and some of the people who were in charge of Manson when he was in custody said he couldn't read. He had like a first, third grade reading level, but apparently he read that book. He read the Bible. He read Robert Heinlein's book, Stranger from a Strange Land, or this stuff was told to him. There's so many things I never was able to really figure out what was true and what wasn't, which is what was so frustrating for all the reporting I did on this.
yeah, like were you able to identify like how he got out of parole and who was like was he just out there like on his own accord? Was he like working with people?
Well,
What was that like?
yeah, I mean, really, the crux of my book examines the 2 years he was out of prison in the late 60s when he transformed from Charlie Manson, this kind of short con artist from West Virginia, into Charlie Manson, this guru type evil leader who could get people to go out and kill on command. And during the 2 years of his freedom, from 67 to 69, the first year first year and a half, he had a parole officer named Roger Smith, who that's a big chunk of the book. Is I started doing FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests to the Bureau of Prisons for Manson's parole records, and nobody had ever asked for them before, or if they had, they hadn't fought for them because they had never released them. And my dad was a lawyer, and luckily I kind of pulled him into the vortex, and against his best, intentions, he started saying, yeah, I'm reading the laws here and they have to release this stuff to you. So I would write a letter about what I wanted, and then he'd go over the letter and put it all in legalese. And over the period of about a year and a half, I started getting the slow drip of releases. And I found out that, during his first year, his probation officer, Roger Smith, was very aware that Manson not only was continuing to commit crimes when he was up in the Bay Area, but he was building this family of young women, some of them underage, who he was using as prostitutes, getting them involved in petty. He created a crime family. It was mostly petty up there, and but it became what they became a year later in Los Angeles. But this was with the federal government's knowledge, because Roger Smith had to report everything back to the main offices. So I have the letters and the status reports, and that's when I started wondering, was Manson being enabled to do what he was doing, and if so, why? And you asked about MK Ultra, and there was another program called COINTELPRO, which was run by the FBI. There were two of these secret operations that were born, really. Well, MK Ultra began in the late 40s, early 50s. That was a mind control program by the CIA where they were testing drugs and other means of coercion on unsuspecting Americans. They had safe houses set up in the Haight-Ashbury and New York City where they would prostitutes would lure Johns in and then dose them with LSD, and they'd be observed by CIA doctors from one-way mirrors, or they'd film them, and they were trying to learn how to control people's behavior. So that was going on from about 1949 to 1973. And in the middle of all this, Manson learned to do exactly what they were doing and wanted to do, which was to create programmed assassins. And at the time, he evolved into this, genius manipulator. He was going to the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, a private clinic open to provide medical care for runaways and people who had come to San Francisco during the Summer of Love in '67. And Roger Smith, just his parole officer, was coincidentally doing a drug research program there. And one of his colleagues, Lewis West, Jolly West, was actually working in the CIA's MK Ultra operation. So there's kind of like this merging of official agencies, Charles Manson And then Manson blossoms into exactly what MK Ultra was trying to create, someone who could do what they wanted. And also COINTELPRO was an FBI operation that was kind of the counterpart. They weren't using drugs, to my knowledge, or coercion, but they were trying to use false information and infiltration to dismantle and neutralize the left-wing movement. And their first target was the Panthers, who really, were born in Oakland in about 65. And by 67 had become this national, actually international group that was, in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, Lyndon Johnson, who was the president, Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California, the greatest threat to American stability, since the Civil War, and they needed to dismantle it. So it's hard to kind of talk about it in the nutshell, but if you read the book, you see how everything that kind of happened with Manson, 68 and 69, achieved the objectives of both MK Ultra and COINTELPRO. And there were these shady figures around Manson who I'm alleging in the book they were agents for both of those operations.
Did you find any evidence Charles Manson was associated with those programs?
No, I couldn't find any evidence beyond the fact, the circumstantial evidence, that every time he got arrested and his nature of crime escalated. So by the time he was in Los Angeles, he moved his commune from the Haight-Ashbury district to Los Angeles in 68. And they went out to a remote cowboy dude ranch that they kind of took over in Chatsworth called Spawn Ranch. If anybody's seen Quentin Tarantino's movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it kind of covers that. And during that period, he basically had a get out of jail free card while he was being monitored. So, I have all of the documentation that there were sources on the ranch reporting back to the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, who was working with the FBI in the COINTEL program, about Manson building this arsenal and planning to attack blacks, which is exactly what COINTELPRO did. They tried to target groups and get them to attack each other and kill each other, or commit crimes where they could then go in and arrest them. So it's pretty crazy. But the case I have in the book is circumstantial. I've never found a document saying Charlie was working for us. I've had experts and, even a judge who had Manson in front of him in 68 on a minor charge in Ventura, who also had been a district attorney, look at all the documents I had and, said there's no way that Manson wasn't some type of informant. He was working for somebody in law enforcement. And I said to him, who? And he said, well, that's what you got to find out. It could have been the FBI, the CIA, the DEA, but his exact quote was, he was more important out on the street than behind bars to someone. So yeah, everything in the book is basically a framework of what ifs. And then I asked the question, well, why? Why was this withheld? Bugliosi knew all of this and didn't share it with the defense, who would have been able to use it to create reasonable doubt in all different ways that, Manson had people manipulating or pushing him. So yeah, unfortunately, hopefully I'm actually getting close to maybe getting some good answers for the second book, and I'm going to try to make my decision within the next 6 months or so whether or not I'm going to pull the trigger on that. And I'm going to do that if I can get what you just asked for, actual evidence that he was part of these programs.
Yeah, my thoughts are maybe that's how he knew what the future held. Maybe that's where he's get the ideas from.
Yeah, exactly.
So, because everything in government's delayed. They're working on something now that people probably won't even realize had been worked on in 30, 40, 50
MK
years.
Ultra, for instance, it was begun in 49 and officially it ended in 73. A lot of people think it didn't end, but in its time, it was the most covert operation that the United States government had ever had. It was the most expensive, and it was entirely illegal. The CIA isn't allowed to act domestically. They can't do stuff on our soil. And they had, safe houses all over the country. They were testing drugs and hypnosis on prisoners at military bases, and in the general public for what is that, 20 some years. And then they destroyed all the records in 1973 when they were scared that it was going to be discovered.
Is there is there anyone that's known to be in the program that you've ever met or is still around?
Yeah, not so much around anymore, but again, I began this in 99. So I interviewed probably 3 or 4 uh witting, meaning they knew they were working for MK Ultra doctors, and they minimized what they did, or all this stuff came. I mean, if people are interested, it all came out in 1975, 76, and 77, and there were 3 congressional investigations into it. So the CIA officers who ran it, Richard Helms, Sidney Gottlieb, they all had to testify to Congress, and all that stuff is part of the public record. You can look it up, or I discuss it pretty thoroughly in my book. They basically had amnesia. Ironically, that's what they were trying to create in their subjects, was amnesia of what they had programmed them to do. They couldn't remember. They minimized everything. And the 2 or 3 that I spoke to did the same thing. Like, well, we were doing that, but no, it wasn't on unwitting. Everybody signed consent forms, and that wasn't true. So, and they were all pretty elderly then. So there are none that are alive now, unless the program continued beyond 73, which that's beyond my pay scale. All my reporting stops on like 73, 74. But a lot of people think that, and I think there's a good argument for it, they did achieve a lot of their objectives. They did. I mean, Jolly West reported to the CIA in 1955 that he had learned how to remove true memories in a person and replace them with false ones without their knowledge. So if they figured out how to do that in 55, I'm sure it got, and it's a long story. It's in the book how I found those documents, which are so rare. If they could do that then, I think that their technology increased tenfold, and they're probably still using it today. Every time there's a mass shooting, I get inundated with emails from people who believe that these mass shooters are all Manchurian candidates, MK Ultra victims who are out there doing it for. I just, I can't even respond. I said, look, my expertise stops in 75, and you guys find somebody else to look into that. I don't want to do it.
Yeah, because in the book, did you detail like an account of someone committing some sort of crime?
Well, yeah. So this Jolly West began working in MK Ultra. He accidentally left his correspondence with the CIA in his files, and he died about a year or 2 before I started reporting. And he had been the chairman of the neuroscience department at UCLA, very prominent, ran their psychiatric studies groups, and donated his massive files from 40 years of research and teaching. And to his dying day, he'd been accused, even on the front page of the New York Times, of being a part of MK Ultra, and he denied it. So they approached him and said he wouldn't do it. And he threatened to sue people if they alleged this. So he went to his grave never being proven. It had only been hypothesized. Well, I found in these files, misfiled, these letters between him and Sidney Gottlieb, who was a CIA kind of, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Poisoner in Chief. But he was the head of the chemical department of the CIA in the 40s, 50s, 60s, till he left in 72. And he was the head of the MK Ultra program. And it's basically Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb. And Sidney Gottlieb was using his alias Sherman Grifford in these letters, discussing how they're going to do these how Jolly's going to do these experiments. At that time, he was at the Lackland Air Force Base on psychiatric patients there, airmen who were getting psychiatric treatment or prisoners. And during the same period that he contracted to test people with these drugs without their knowledge, see if he could create fugue states, amnesias, get them to commit acts against their moral code. There was this horrific rape murder of a 3-year-old girl in Lackland, Texas. And the guy who had abducted this little girl in the middle of the night, was found near her body in a gravel pit, wandering around in a daze, saying he didn't know how he got there. And he was an airman at Lackland who've been treated for these migraine headaches for about 2 years that were so severe he'd have to be he couldn't get out of bed for a couple days. And it's a long, detailed story, but I believe he was one of Jolly's first experiments that went wrong. I don't think they ever wanted him to go out and kill a 3-year-old girl. And I don't think they wanted Sharon Tate and her friends murdered at the Tate house. I think things just got, they were experimenting with people's minds and not being regulated. So shit went wrong all the time back then.
Well, I'm glad that you wrote the book. For anyone that hasn't read it, go ahead and read it, and appreciate you having you on, Tom. It was great.
Okay, well, thanks for having me.